guys, so let's talk a little bit about composition and melody. So composing a melody is really just like improvising, but with the added benefit of being able to go back and revise. That is, you can go back and modify whatever you've written if you don't like it. Now, there's no right or wrong method to writing a melody. If you get 10 musicians in the same room, you'll get 11 opinions on how to write a song. So if you don't agree with what I'm going to say here, that's perfectly fine, just ignore everything I say. Alright, so there are 4 basic elements of music, and various genres of music place differing levels of importance to each of these elements. Now, melody is the most important element in most songs, especially jazz and pop songs. And that's largely what I'm going to be talking about in this video. But some genres of music place a lot of emphasis on harmony. For example, modal jazz has to use modal harmony, and 12-tone serialism has to use atonality. And even a blues generally uses a 12-bar blues chord progression. So that if you get rid of or change the harmony in these genres of music, you're almost getting rid of or changing the genre you're playing in. Or at the very least, you have to do other things to compensate for the lack of the correct harmony in that genre of music. Similarly, some genres of music place more emphasis on rhythm. For example, all Afro-Cuban jazz has to adhere to a clave rhythm. Similarly, rock and roll has to have a pretty sort of particular rhythm or sound to it. Similarly, boogie woogie has a very distinctive rhythm. And in fact, in any kind of dance music, generally the rhythm is very important. It's important to have a strong beat with a solid groove. And again, in some genres of music, the timbre is more important. For example, in free jazz and arguably punk and thrash metal. Right, in the latter two, the melody is less important. It's more to do with sort of attitude. You need sort of heavily distorted guitars and sort of screaming into the microphone and have a really kind of aggressive type of attitude. But I'm going to restrict this video to focusing only on the melody element. So then generally, if you want to write a regular run-of-the-mill song, whether it be jazz or pop or country or classical or whatever, the most important element is the melody. So then when writing a song or composing a song, I would always start with the melody. Having a memorable and interesting melody is the most important part of a song. And the melody should be able to stand up on its own without any chords and still be interesting. So what you want to do is you want to create a melody and play it by itself without any chords. And if it still sounds interesting, then it's probably a good melody. So then my really oversimplified approach to composition is then write a melody, harmonize the melody, and then arrange the composition. So a widely used technique when writing stories or novels or books is the Snowflake Method, where you start with something really small and really basic and kind of just keep adding to it and adding to it and adding to it until you've got something much more elegant and complex and interesting. Now, I recommend using something very similar to write a song. You start with a really simple bare bones melody, then embellish the melody a bit by adding a few grace notes or passing notes or like ornamentals, things like that. And then you harmonize the melody. Now, I have 2 whole very long videos on reharmonization, and the same concepts apply. You have to make the main or the key melody note of each bar an acceptable harmony that is either a guide tone or an available tension over the chord that you pick to harmonize the melody. And you also need to have a strong structured chord progression. So you can watch my reharmonization videos where I go over this in a bit of detail. I'm not gonna just repeat it here. And then when you've got the melody and the harmony, then you've essentially written a lead sheet for yourself of your song. So then the next step is to arrange your composition or your song, by doing things like giving your song some kind of form, adding chord voicings, adding instrumentation if it's for a band, adding dynamics, adding an intro or an outro, right? Those kind of things. So you kind of tack all those sort of secondary things on once you've got the bass melody and the bass chords. So let's have a look at how melody can be thought about or structured. Now, there are essentially 4 ways to analyze, think about, and write a melody. The first way is to look at intervals. That is, you're looking at the notes themselves and the relationships between the notes, ignoring the rhythm. Now, the melody could move in steps, which will give you a really smooth, melodic, lyrical, and singable melody, especially if it's a diatonic scale that you're using. Or you can use skips, so like arpeggios, or leaps, so sort of larger jumps. And these will give you a more jagged and angular melody. So you should generally try keep your leaps to less than an octave. And these things all together combine to give you a pitch contour, which is essentially just a connect the dots with the notes. So you trace out what the pitch of the melody is doing to see how quickly it's increasing and how quickly it's decreasing, and whether there are any sort of sharp angles and things like that. So then a smooth line with a narrow range tends to be very smooth and relaxing, whereas a jagged and sort of angular line tends to be a bit more intense and, well, jagged. And you should also pay attention to the highest and the lowest note in your melody. And the highest note should be a kind of climax, and should usually, though certainly not always, be about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the song. Again, to build to a kind of climax. So the song could be around here, and then you build to a climax up here, then you go back down and kind of end it and resolve it. And songs that use this kind of idea of interval patterns are ones like ESP, which uses intervals of fourths, and In Walked Bud, which kind of uses an augmenting or an interval that's getting larger. The second way to think about melodies is in terms of motifs. And this takes into account both the intervals and the rhythm of the notes. And then you can repeat the motif throughout the song, or kind of sequence it and transpose it up or down. And this is exactly what the song Satin Doll does. Right, it introduces a motif and then just replays that exact same motif, but a couple notes higher. And then you can sort of go further and develop your motif by transposing it, or changing the rhythm, or playing it upside down or backwards, or playing it slower or faster, or just playing a fragment of it, and those types of things. And of course you can also embellish the motif. And so thinking about melody in terms of motifs takes both intervals and the rhythmic density into account. That is, how many notes there are per bar, how squished together all the different notes are. And different styles of music use different rhythmic densities. Where swing music, for example, uses a low rhythmic density, and bebop uses a very high rhythmic density. That is, there are a lot of notes squished into every single bar. Now, the third way you can think about or analyze a melody is in terms of scales. That is, looking at the notes and their relationship to a particular scale. And of course, you can base a melody around a specific scale, which is what the song Juju by Wayne Shorter does, at least the first part. It's based off the whole tone scale and only uses notes from the whole tone scale. And another neat little trick is to use a kind of modal interchange, but in melody. So try playing a major melody, but in a minor key, or a minor melody in a major key, or an Ionian melody in a Lydian mode, or Aeolian melody in Dorian mode. Right, that can sound nice as well. So instead of a melody like this, which is obviously in the key of C major, you could play something like this, which is in C minor. And the final way to think about and analyze and create a melody is in terms of harmony. That is, creating a melody that's based off the degrees of a chord, and looking at the relationship between the notes in the melody and the chord. So in a sense, this is like creating a melody made out of arpeggios. But another common technique is to create a melody based on guide tones. So the guide tones are just the third and the seventh of a particular chord. And songs that do this include Autumn Leaves and Fly Me to the Moon and All the Things You Are. So for example, Autumn Leaves goes like this. Then it sits on the C, which is the third of the A minor 7 chord, and the seventh of the D7 chord. Sits on the B, which is the third of the G major 7 chord, and the seventh of the C major 7 chord. Then it sits on the A, which is the third of the F sharp half diminished chord, and the seventh of the B7 chord. Then it finishes on the G, which is just the third of the E minor 7 chord, which is our tonic chord. So that entire melody of Autumn Leaves is just based around the guide tones of each chord. And this creates a kind of guide tone line. That is, the guide tones move as follows. And you'll find generally that guide tone lines are descending, though of course that's not always and necessarily the case. And so essentially then when you have your guide tone line, all you have to do is embellish the guide tone line with either passing notes or grace notes or trills or octaves and double stops and stuff, or things like that. So then your melody is really just a whole bunch of guide tones, but with a few embellishments. And of course, you could also have multiple guide tone lines moving at once through a particular set of chord changes. Now, a few other things you should consider when writing a melody are the following. And they can generally all be summed up with the phrase, all things in moderation. Now, your overarching goal in creating a melody, which is just like improvising, is to build tension and then resolve that tension. And you also want to make sure that your melody has structure, whether that be through repetition of a motif, including sequences or motivic development, things like that, or through the use of diatonic keys and scales and tonality to kind of ground your melody to a particular root note. And repetition can actually build tension. If you just keep playing the same thing again and again, eventually your audience expects something to change or something to happen, like any moment now, which in a sense kind of builds tension. And a song that does this particularly well, in my opinion, is the song Stolen Moments. So have a listen to that. Your song should also have a mixture of steps, skips, and leaps. Right, you don't want to have a melody that just uses steps or skips, because then it'll sound like you're playing a scale or an arpeggio or something. You want to have a nice mix of steps, so that it's nice and sort of smooth and fluid and lyrical, and then a few jumps and leaps. And that kind of builds some interest by having a nice smooth phrase, followed by a kind of jagged and angular phrase. Your melody should also generally lead to a climax point, that is the highest pitched note. And you should make use of contrasts and opposites. Parts of the melody should be dense and other parts sparse. Some parts should be intense and some parts relaxed. Some parts should use the high register and some parts should use a lower register. which is just like the concept of creating a little bit of tension and then resolving that tension. However, you want to avoid non sequiturs. Right, a little bit of change is good, but not too much. Melodies should generally flow naturally and sort of follow a little bit of a pattern and only change gradually. You don't want drastic changes in rhythm or density or range or pitch. Like going from eighth notes in C major in the bass to whole notes in A flat melodic minor in the treble. Right, that might sound a bit weird and disjointed. Which is fine if that's the effect you're going for, but just keep this in mind. The melodic rhythm should generally stay somewhat consistent, the density should be somewhat consistent, the pitch contour should be somewhat consistent, and the range should be somewhat consistent. Right, so you want some change and some contrast and some opposites, but not too much, so you avoid non sequiturs. So it still sounds like you're playing the same song. You haven't just finished this song down here and suddenly started a new song up here. There has to be some kind of logical transformation from one phrase or one part of the melody to the next. Now also, when the melody is static, so if it sits on one note, you should move the harmony or the chords. And when the melody is moving around a lot, then you should try keep the harmony relatively static. Or if you're writing bebop, then everything should move all the time. Similarly, if you're writing in a fast tempo, you should generally have a slow harmonic rhythm, that is, slow chord changes, so a chord lasts 1 or 2 bars. Whereas if you're using a slow tempo, then you should have a faster harmonic rhythm, so chord changes every half bar maybe. Or again, if you're writing bebop, then you want a fast tempo with a fast harmonic rhythm. And humans are generally pretty conservative creatures. We don't like change. Every time a new genre of music is released, people fight against it, whether it be bebop or free jazz or rock and roll or rap or metal or whatever. So you should generally have some references to the past and use some sort of familiar surprises and cliches and overused melodies and riffs and overused devices, but you should also add a little bit of novelty. But only a little bit. Your phrases should also vary in length, so they're not all the same. And you should try change melodic direction every 4 or 5 notes, so it doesn't sound like you're just playing a scale or some kind of exercise. Now, so all these kind of rules or suggestions or sort of guidelines that I just covered are perfectly fine, but if you'll forgive my simplicity, I personally prefer to just write a melody that sounds good. Right, there's no reason to restrict yourself to a particular scale or key or intervallic pattern or harmony. I personally would just start with the practical side of things, that is, create an actual melody ignoring all else. Right, because there's a danger that you overthink a song and use unnecessary abstractions and theorizing. So like trying to decide, what key to use or what form to use or what rhythm to use or what chord progression to use or what meter to use or whatever. Right, these things are important. We wouldn't have giant steps without Coltrane overthinking chord progressions, or Take 5 without Desmond and Brubeck overthinking meters. But at least to start with, what you want to do is just write a nice and pleasant melody, ignoring all else. In a sense, all those other considerations, like what scale to use or what key to use or chords, they should kind of come or develop naturally from the incredible melody that you've created. And the way I personally create melodies is kind of just by doodling about on the piano or whatever instrument you're using. So you just sit down at your instrument and just start playing stuff until you find a riff or a lick or a particular phrase that you like, and then take that as your motif for your melody. So something like, and then suddenly, hey, that sounded kind of nice. Yeah, that sounds alright. I can use that as my motif of my melody of the song that I'm going to create. So then you take that little phrase and you use it as the beginning of your melody, as a kind of motif, and then you work from there. So for example, I wrote a really simple melody for this lesson, which is a kind of romantic ballady type song, and it goes as follows. So it's just a short melody that's 8 bars long, a kind of A section, that's then repeated, though with a little bit of variation. So in a sense, it's kind of the beginning of a song with an AA-BA form. Right, so the melody's nothing special, but it's also kind of nice and interesting. It uses a combination of skips and steps, which are nice and smooth, followed by a couple leaps. Which I kind of like. It gives a little bit of contrast, sort of a smooth flowing bit followed by a tritone leap, which is really dissonant. And actually that first little phrase is just stolen from a blues riff. But instead of using a flat 7, I just used a natural 7. And so the basic melody would just go, which is essentially just tracing out the F major 7 arpeggio with a passing note. And I've just thrown in a little grace note just to embellish the melody a little bit. And so then that's kind of my motif. And then I just kind of repeat that, but with a little bit of variation. So I just ran up the whole tone scale. Right, it's kind of very similar. It's more or less the same little motif, just changed up a little bit. Then in the last 4 bars, the melody doesn't really move. It just sits on the A for a while. So then instead, I'm going to have the chords, or the harmony move, which will make it a little bit more interesting. And you can also add maybe some rhythmic displacement or some rhythmic interest into your melody by either anticipating or delaying the beat. And again, like I said before, this kind of builds tension through repetition as the listener is expecting something to happen. So then that's my first 8 bars, which is my A section. And then I just repeat that same A section, but with a couple variations. Like for example, at the end, I don't sit on the A for a whole bunch of bars, I descend chromatically. And then instead of finishing on the E, I finish on the E flat, which kind of implies a bit of a modal interchange. We've changed from C major to C minor. So then once I've got my melody, the next step to do is to put in my chords. And to start with, just put in basic 7th chords, block chords. So the melody stayed the same. I've now put in some chords, and already that's sort of starting to take shape and sound a little bit more interesting. But I've just played around with the harmony a little bit to make it a bit more interesting. So in the first A section I start on the F major 7, but on the second A section I start on the D flat minor 7. Again, just to mix things up a bit. And I've put in a really structurally strong descending non-resolving 2/5 at the end. Down to the tonic chord of C major. Or in the second A section, C minor. Right, and then the final thing to do is to arrange your chord progression. Like for example, by adding some nice chord voicings. So like this. And on top of this, like I mentioned before, you'd add an intro, an outro, maybe a solo section, maybe you'll add some dynamics or harmonize the melody, and sort of just keep building up from that basic melody and those basic chords and make it more and more interesting and more complex. Again, just like the Snowflake Method. And that, in a nutshell, is how I would go about writing and composing a melody and a song. So I hope that helped a little bit. As I said at the beginning, writing a melody is incredibly personal and incredibly subjective, and there's a million different ways to do it. And if this doesn't work for you, don't do it your own way, that's fine. But nevertheless, hopefully you found some of the points I covered here at least a little bit enlightening. Otherwise, thanks for watching guys, and see ya.